January 17, 1944. The sun barely pierces the morning fog over a remote American POW camp in the Pacific. The air is thick with the scent of cooked rice and stewed meat, mingling with the damp smell of tropical earth. Rows of wooden barracks stand orderly, their windows releasing thin columns of smoke from small cooking fires. Japanese soldiers, thin, sunburned, and wary, shuffle forward under the watchful eyes of American guards. Their eyes widen at the sight before them: polished mess tables, bowls of steaming food, and neatly stacked utensils. The aroma alone is alien, rich, oily, and hot in a way they have not smelled in months of battle. A soldier lifts a spoonful of stew, hesitates, and freezes. Around him, others exchange quiet, bewildered glances. Some crouch, almost ashamed, as if this abundance is a trap they had trained for hunger, for scarcity, for the indignities of defeat, but not for this. In this moment, the war outside still rages, bombs fall, ships burn, but inside this camp, the first shock of a strange mercy begins to sink in. The line between survival and disbelief has never felt so thin. The shock of the first meal would soon become the first lesson in a war none of them expected. By early 1942, the Pacific War had settled into a brutal rhythm, the Japanese Empire following. Its rapid conquests across Southeast Asia had inflicted devastating losses on Allied forces. Singapore had fallen, the Philippines were under Japanese control, and naval victories at the Coral Sea and early phases of Midway had emboldened Japanese confidence. Yet behind the headlines of conquest, a different reality waited for the soldiers who would eventually fall into enemy hands. Japanese military doctrine was steeped in discipline and endurance. From boot camp, soldiers were trained to expect the worst: privation, battlefield injuries, and even death at the hands of the enemy. Capture was considered dishonorable. Surrender was tantamount to shame. For this reason, Japanese soldiers approached the idea of being a prisoner of war with a mix of fear, disbelief, and quiet dread. Many assumed that capture meant harsh punishment, starvation, or execution. This mentality was born out of decades of military culture, reinforced by propaganda and rigorous indoctrination. Letters home were scarce. Soldiers internalized stoicism as a virtue, and suffering as a measure of loyalty to the emperor. When Allied forces, particularly Americans, began taking prisoners after battles in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and later the Philippines, the Japanese soldiers had no frame of reference for what awaited them. The Allied forces, by contrast, followed the guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929. Captured soldiers were to be treated humanely, given shelter, medical attention, and adequate food. American commanders understood the psychological as well as practical value of providing for prisoners. Not only did humane treatment adhere to international law, but it also minimized unrest, ensured cooperation in labor, and allowed captured soldiers to recover physically. The process of capture itself was often chaotic. During the Guadalcanal campaign, for example, pockets of Japanese troops found themselves cut off, exhausted, and hungry after days of jungle warfare. Soldiers who had survived bombardments and ambushes faced the sudden, disorienting arrival of American patrols. Weapons were confiscated, and prisoners were often marched to holding areas under armed guard. Some Japanese soldiers resisted even then, forced into hand-to-hand combat before finally submitting. Others, too weak or injured, could offer little resistance. Once secured, the prisoners were transported to temporary camps or forward holding stations. In these locations, the first shock began. Soldiers who had imagined endless suffering or humiliation were met with tents, cots, and warm meals. For many, the initial disbelief was overwhelming. Some refused to eat for the first day or two, convinced that the food was poisoned or part of a trap. Officers attempted to maintain discipline, but the psychological burden of their previous training clashed violently with the reality before them. American forces had also learned from earlier conflicts during World War I and interwar periods the U.S. military had observed the consequences of neglecting POW welfare, outbreaks of disease, failed containment, and international condemnation. By 1943, logistical systems in the Pacific had matured. Supply ships delivered food, medical supplies, and clean clothing too. Camps scattered across islands such as Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later the Philippines. Each camp was carefully organized. Kitchens prepared meals in bulk, barracks were cleaned regularly, and guards enforced both discipline and decency. For Japanese soldiers, accustomed to the extreme scarcity of frontline campaigns, the contrast was staggering, where they had subsisted on foraged roots, spoiled rice, or nothing at all now. Bowls of rice, meat, and vegetables awaited them. Water was clean, latrines were maintained. Even small luxuries, soap, blankets, and medical care were offered without hesitation. To some, it was incomprehensible. To others, it sparked a quiet, reluctant gratitude that conflicted with their ingrained sense of honor. As more soldiers were captured in subsequent campaigns, this pattern repeated, letters and later. Memoirs reveal a consistent theme: shock, disbelief, and eventual cautious acceptance. American camps were not luxurious, but they were consistent, reliable, and above all, humane. The cultural dissonance would shape the prisoner's psychological experience and leave a lasting impression that many carried long after the war ended. The first meals, the first warm beds, and the first medical treatment were not merely acts of sustenance, they were the opening chapter in a story of humanity intersecting with the machinery of war. This moment, where fear met unexpected mercy, set the stage for the complex emotional and tactical dynamics that would unfold in American POW camps. American POW camps in the Pacific were far from the chaotic battlefields that Japanese soldiers had endured. From the outset, the U.S. military focused on organization, hygiene, and sustainability. Camps were typically located on islands with accessible supply routes, often coastal areas or airstrips, allowing provisions to arrive regularly from larger bases or supply ships. Each camp was divided into carefully managed sections: living quarters, kitchens, medical stations, and work areas. Barbed wire and guard towers ensured security, but the human element of care was equally emphasized. The kitchens were the heart of the camp. American cooks, often drawn from military units, trained in field rations and logistics, prepared meals designed to meet both caloric and nutritional needs. Unlike the minimal rice or dried fish many Japanese soldiers were accustomed to, the meals included hot rice, fresh vegetables, salted meat, and occasionally canned fruit or powdered milk. Menus were rotated to avoid monotony, and portions were generous, ensuring that even soldiers weakened from months of combat could regain strength. Mess halls were clean, with utensils and bowls systematically distributed. To a Japanese soldier, this level of order and provision was almost alien. Beyond food, camp hygiene and medical attention were strictly enforced. Latrines were constructed with proper sanitation, and guards monitored cleanliness in sleeping quarters. Medical officers conducted routine checkups, treated minor injuries, and quarantined infectious diseases. Small but significant provisions, such as soap, towels, and mosquito nets, were supplied, reflecting an understanding that a healthy prisoner population required more than just food. For Japanese soldiers, whose previous expectations had been shaped by the austere discipline of the Imperial Army, these standards were astonishing. The administration of the camps reflected a blend of military efficiency and humanitarian concern. Commanders adhered to the Geneva Convention, and reports were meticulously filed regarding prisoner numbers, health conditions, and morale. Letters sent back to Tokyo occasionally described prisoners in surprising terms: well-fed, cooperative, and even contemplative. For Japanese officers and soldiers steeped in the belief that capture equaled dishonor, the sight of organized registers, careful ration distribution, and medical oversight felt both surreal and, in some cases, infuriating. Cultural contrasts extended beyond sustenance. In the Japanese military ethos, modesty Endurance and self-sacrifice were paramount. Soldiers often endured deprivation as a badge of loyalty. In American camps, however, the expectation was different. Prisoners were human beings to be preserved, not punished. This difference in philosophy led to subtle tensions. Some Japanese soldiers resisted initial meals, suspecting poison or trickery. Others approached cautiously, sampling the food in small amounts, their expressions a mix of suspicion and tentative relief. Over time, however, the body's natural need for nourishment began to override ingrained prides. Work routines in the camps further highlighted these differences. Prisoners were often assigned to labor tasks such as maintaining the camp, assisting in supply storage, or aiding in agricultural projects. While labor was compulsory, it was performed under humane conditions, with breaks, shelter, and adequate food provided. In contrast, Japanese soldiers were trained to endure extreme physical strain under harsh supervision, often with minimal food or water. The comparatively safe, structured work in American camps became another source of cultural joy. By the end of the first week in camp, the psychological impact of these conditions began to crystallize. Japanese soldiers, initially stunned, were now faced with a paradox. Their lives were being preserved in a manner that their military training had never anticipated. The shock of abundant food, clean living conditions, and organized routines was intertwined with a quiet, uneasy reflection. Some soldiers began to adapt, recognizing the practical benefits of compliance. Others struggled internally, grappling with shame, disbelief, or a sense of dishonor at having survived while their comrades continued fighting. This environment, a blend of strict order and unexpected humanity, would shape every aspect of the prisoners' experience in the months to come. Meals were no longer mere sustenance, became symbols of a new reality, one where survival was possible without sacrifice of dignity, and where the enemy's moral code was as rigid and disciplined as any battlefield tactic. As the Japanese soldiers settled into this rhythm, the stage was set to explore the multiple angles of their experience: human, tactical, technological, leadership, and moral. Each perspective would reveal a different layer of the cultural shock that accompanied the simple act of eating a meal in an American POW camp. For the Japanese soldiers, the first meals in American POW camps were an emotional jolt. Hunger had been constant on the front lines. Weeks of meager rations, spoiled rice, and foraged roots were the norm. Now, steaming bowls of rice, vegetables, and meat were placed before them with a regularity that defied their expectations. Some soldiers stared silently at the food, hands trembling, unable to reconcile their ingrained fear of capture with the reality of nourishment. Diaries and post-war memoirs repeatedly described this disbelief. The act of eating became an internal struggle, a negotiation between survival instincts and deeply ingrained notions of shame. Slowly, the body's needs began to override pride. The relief was palpable, yet tempered with guilt, to enjoy such abundance while comrades continued to fight in harsh conditions was difficult to process. From a tactical perspective, adequate rations were a deliberate tool. American commanders understood that well-fed prisoners were more cooperative, easier to manage, and less likely to resist or revolt. Camps were designed to maintain order, but morale played a critical role. Hunger breeds desperation, which leads to unrest. Food, on the other hand, stabilized populations. Prisoners who were nourished could follow labor assignments efficiently, maintain hygiene, and recover from combat injuries more quickly. In this way, what seemed like mere generosity also had strategic benefits. Feeding prisoners properly ensured the smooth functioning of the camp and minimized the risk of incidents that could disrupt military operations. The consistency and quality of rations were made possible by the American military's sophisticated logistical network. Supply ships transported fresh and preserved food across vast distances, sometimes hundreds of miles from bases in Australia or Hawaii. Field kitchens were equipped to cook large quantities efficiently, ensuring meals were hot and safe. Soldiers assigned to the kitchens used standardized recipes and portioning systems to maintain both nutrition and morale. Even under the constraints of wartime shipping, the system ensured that the camps could operate without food shortages for Japanese soldiers who had witnessed chaotic supply lines and improvised meals on the front lines. This level of efficiency was nearly unbelievable, testament to industrial-scale planning and the prioritization of prisoner welfare. Leadership in American POW camps emphasized discipline combined with humanitarian care. Commanders enforced rules strictly, but their priorities were clear: maintain order, comply with international law, and preserve life. Officers personally oversaw food distribution, hygiene, inspections, and medical care. They understood that humane treatment was not only ethically necessary but also strategically sound. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to harsh discipline and punitive authority, this was disorienting. Their own officers had often enforced obedience through fear, deprivation, and ritualized suffering. In contrast, American officers commanded through a balance of authority and care, presenting prisoners with predictable routines and opportunities for dignity. This philosophical difference contributed significantly to the psychological impact of camp life, shaping how prisoners experienced every aspect of their daily existence. By the end of the first weeks, these four dimensions, human, tactical, technological, and leadership, intertwined to create a complex, sometimes contradictory reality. Soldiers were fed, sheltered, and protected, yet internally conflicted. They were disciplined, yet given autonomy to recover. Every meal, every ration, and every clean barracks became a symbol of the unfamiliar. Reminder that survival no longer demanded the extreme sacrifice and suffering they had been trained to endure. From the perspective of Japanese soldiers, the treatment in American camps was not only surprising but at times incomprehensible. Letters smuggled home or written after the war described disbelief at the abundance of food and cleanliness of facilities. Many soldiers expected harsh punishment, hunger, or physical coercion, reflecting their military indoctrination and cultural perception of surrender as shameful. Some viewed the generous rations with suspicion, fearing hidden poisons or intentional deception. Others expressed a quiet frustration, unable to reconcile the enemy's benevolence with the brutal experiences they had faced in combat. This cognitive dissonance between the reality of humane treatment and the expectations shaped by propaganda and tradition added a psychological dimension to captivity. Shock, hesitation, and eventual acceptance created a slow, complex adjustment to daily life in the camps. The experience of Japanese POWs in American camps also highlights a profound moral contrast. At a time when the Pacific Theater was defined by brutality, Bataan, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima captured soldiers encountered a system grounded in law, ethics, and respect for human life. The Geneva Convention was not merely a document, it was operationalized through disciplined procedures, clean barracks, and carefully prepared meals. For some prisoners, the shock was accompanied by a philosophical realization: even in war, morality could be maintained. The simple act of providing adequate food became a statement of ethical authority, challenging the prisoners' assumptions about enemies, survival, and duty. Soldiers reflected later that while the battlefield demanded endurance and sacrifice, the camp offered a lesson in mercy, dignity, and the resilience of human decency. Together, these angles reveal the multi-layered impact of American POW camp policies: the human shock and adaptation, the tactical benefits of stable morale, the technological efficiency of supply chains, the leadership philosophy enforcing humane treatment, and the cultural and moral confrontation all coalesced to define the prisoner's experience, each dimension reinforced the others. Efficient kitchens and logistics enabled consistent rations, which supported morale. Humane leadership ensured compliance, and the cultural contrast intensified the psychological effect. By the end of this phase, Japanese soldiers were navigating an unfamiliar reality, one where survival did not require extreme suffering, yet obedience, adaptation, and cultural humility were still demanded. This intricate web of reactions, strategies, and human experience created the conditions for the pivotal moments that would define captivity, the climax of shock, adjustment, and psychological transformation in the camps. By mid-1943, the American POW system in the Pacific had reached full operational capacity. Camps across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines were receiving an increasing number of Japanese prisoners following intense battles such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Leyte Campaign. For many of the captured soldiers, the first full day in camp marked the apex of cultural and psychological shock. On Guadalcanal, for instance, a group of Japanese soldiers captured in late 1942 were marched into a temporary camp under the dense morning mist. They had endured weeks of jungle combat, subsisting on meager rations of spoiled rice, coconuts, and water from streams. Their uniforms were torn, bodies emaciated, and minds dulled by exhaustion. As they crossed the threshold of the American-controlled compound, they were met with something wholly unexpected: clean cots, regular meals, and soldiers tending to them with professional courtesy. The first meals were simple by American standards, yet lavish compared to what the prisoners had known: bowls of white rice, salted meat, vegetables, and occasionally canned fruit. Japanese corporal, later interviewed in post-war accounts, recalled lifting a spoonful of stew and hesitating for what felt like an eternity, certain it must be poisoned. Around him, other soldiers mimicked his caution, eyes darting for signs of deception. The camp's mess halls, polished and orderly, were in stark contrast to the mud, blood, and chaos of the battlefield. This initial disbelief gradually gave way to physiological necessity. Soldiers, starved and malnourished, could not resist the nourishment for long. Their bodies responded before their minds could reconcile the paradox. Within days, many reported increased energy, fewer illnesses, and the beginning of physical recovery, yet the psychological adjustment was slower. Letters later sent home described a mix of gratitude and shame. Some admitted the relief of clean food and regular sleep, but few could openly express enjoyment without feeling dishonor for surviving while their comrades continued fighting. The American leadership structure reinforced this adjustment. Officers personally supervised the distribution of rations, monitored health, and ensured that prisoners adhered to hygiene standards. Medical staff conducted daily examinations, treating malaria, dysentery, and other tropical illnesses. In some cases, severely wounded soldiers were given priority care, a gesture that challenged deeply held beliefs about what a soldier deserved after capture. Every act, from a bowl of rice to a simple bandage, became part of the broader lesson: survival was possible without sacrifice of dignity. The camp's organization extended beyond sustenance. Prisoners were assigned to controlled labor duties, maintaining barracks, assisting in kitchens, and cultivating small vegetable plots. The work was intentionally manageable, with proper breaks and adequate food, providing both structure and purpose for Japanese soldiers trained in the relentless demands of battlefield labor. This treatment was unprecedented. Some officers attempted to enforce traditional notions of discipline, encouraging endurance and stoicism, but the American system of humane oversight prevailed. One particularly illustrative case occurred at a POW camp in the Philippines, where a group of Japanese engineers had been captured after a failed defensive operation. Accustomed to near starvation and extreme punishment, they initially refused to enter the mess hall. American guards, recognizing the cultural hesitation, approached with patience rather than force, explaining the system, demonstrating its safety, and allowing small quantities to be tasted first. By the end of the second day, these soldiers were consuming full meals, a process that symbolized the broader psychological transformation taking place across the Pacific POW network. The first few weeks in camp were marked by tension and adaptation. The paradox of care amid conflict produced both relief and internal conflict. Prisoners were learning that their survival depended not on endurance through suffering alone, but also on acceptance of the unfamiliar. Regular food, medical care, and structured routines, the shock of humane treatment reached its peak here, creating a turning point in the prisoners' experience. By the time the Japanese soldiers fully engaged with camp life, they were no longer merely captives, they were participants in a system that valued human life, logistics, and moral order. Reality that would shape their perceptions long after liberation, the profound dissonance between expectation and reality set the stage for the aftermath of captivity, the long-term consequences of humane treatment and cultural shock, both physically and psychologically. As weeks turned into months, the initial shock experienced by Japanese prisoners of war began to evolve into deeper psychological and cultural realizations. What started as disbelief at the abundance of food gradually transformed into reflection, adaptation, and for some, internal conflict. Soldiers began to confront the cognitive dissonance between the values instilled by their training and the humane reality imposed by their captors. In New Guinea, letters and later memoirs recount Japanese soldiers noting the regularity of meals and the cleanliness of the camp with astonishment. One sergeant wrote that the rice was white, unburned, and warm, while vegetables were fresh and plentiful, a far cry from the rationed, often spoiled, supplies of the battlefield. For soldiers who had been conditioned to accept suffering as honor, such provisions were almost insulting. Yet, as the days passed, many quietly acknowledged that survival under these conditions was preferable to pride or rigid adherence to cultural expectation. Beyond nourishment, other aspects of camp life reinforced this realization. Medical care, while routine in American camps, was revolutionary to Japanese prisoners. Malaria, dysentery, and wounds that would have proven fatal in the field were treated promptly and systematically. Some soldiers were astonished to receive multiple doses of medication, clean bandages, and attentive care from nurses and medics. These acts of preservation were not only practical, they were symbolic. They demonstrated that the enemy could act with compassion even amid war. Revelation that unsettled traditional views of honor, sacrifice, and duty. Work assignments, though compulsory, further challenged the prisoners' worldview. Tasks were designed to keep the camps functional, assisting in the kitchen, maintaining living quarters, or tending small agricultural plots. Labor was conducted under humane conditions, with adequate rest and food, in stark contrast to the extreme demands of the Japanese military ethos. Prisoners began to notice the subtle rewards of cooperation, better health, predictability, and a sense of regained agency in a situation previously defined by fear and chaos. These experiences created a spectrum of psychological responses. Some soldiers embraced the stability, gradually forming bonds with fellow prisoners and recognizing the practical advantages of camp life. Others wrestled with shame and guilt, grappling with the notion that accepting aid from the enemy could be seen as dishonorable. Letters sent home often reflected this tension, describing meals and hygiene with wonder, but couched in careful language to avoid admitting vulnerability or enjoyment. Cultural realization also extended to the broader moral dimension of warfare. Prisoners observed, often silently, that their captors adhered to laws, procedures, and ethical standards even in the midst of a global conflict. These observations contradicted their preconceptions of the enemy as purely ruthless and devoid of honor. The predictable kindness, structured order, and consistent nourishment began to challenge deeply held beliefs that war was solely about survival through suffering and that mercy was absent from combat. By the fourth or fifth week in camp, many prisoners had fully adapted to the routines. Meals were no longer approached with suspicion. Work assignments were performed reliably. Hygiene standards were maintained voluntarily. Yet beneath this practical compliance lay a quiet, transformative reflection. The experience of being cared for by an enemy did not simply preserve life, it reshaped perceptions of humanity, honor, and moral responsibility. For soldiers trained To see suffering as inevitable and mercy as impossible, this was nothing short of revolutionary. The climax of the Japanese soldiers' POW experience was therefore not a dramatic battle or escape attempt, it was the slow, cumulative recognition that life could continue under humane conditions even at the hands of the enemy. This understanding marked a turning point. The prisoners were no longer defined solely by fear or despair. They had survived the initial shock, adapted to the daily reality of provision and care, and confronted the complex interplay of cultural pride, moral expectation, and practical necessity. This period of deep adjustment prepared the stage for the aftermath of captivity. It revealed the long-term consequences of humane treatment, not only on physical survival, but also on psychological resilience, cultural perspective, and the ethical reflections of soldiers who had once expected only hardship and punishment. The story of the first meals, the clean barracks, and the steady routines culminated here, shaping the final chapters of their wartime experience. The immediate consequences of humane treatment in American POW camps were striking, both physically and psychologically, for Japanese soldiers who had endured the extreme deprivation of jungle warfare and relentless combat. The provision of regular, nutritious meals triggered rapid physical recovery. Emaciated bodies began to regain weight, fatigue and illness gradually abated. Diseases that had once decimated frontline units, malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections, were treated systematically, resulting in lower mortality rates than might have been expected. Under comparable circumstances, medical logs from camps in the Solomon Islands and the Philippines record improved health statistics among prisoners within weeks of arrival, underscoring the tangible benefits of care and sustenance. Morale, while initially fragile, also began to stabilize. Soldiers who had approached camp life with suspicion or fear slowly realized that compliance with camp routines was both safe and advantageous. Meals, clean quarters, and predictable schedules provided a structure that contrasted sharply with the chaos of battle, while Japanese cultural norms associated surrender with shame. The American approach forced prisoners to confront a different framework. Survival and cooperation could coexist with dignity. Guards and officers reported that prisoners became more orderly, less resistant, and increasingly willing to perform assigned labor tasks. These small but consistent changes in behavior reflected a profound psychological shift. Prisoners were adapting not just physically, but mentally, to the reality of humane captivity. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a spectrum of responses. Some soldiers expressed quiet relief, acknowledging that the abundance of food and the predictability of camp life allowed them to regain strength. Others struggled internally with guilt or shame, feeling that accepting care from the enemy conflicted with their sense of honor. Yet even these conflicted emotions underscored the depth of the cultural shock. The prisoners were learning that survival did not necessitate suffering, and that humane treatment could coexist with military defeat. The tactical implications for American forces were equally significant. By providing consistent rations and care, POW camps minimized unrest and resistance, ensuring a stable and manageable prisoner population. Soldiers who were physically nourished and medically treated required less supervision, performed labor efficiently, and posed a reduced risk of escape or mutiny. In essence, the humane approach achieved both ethical and operational goals. It preserved life while maintaining camp security and functionality. The first months in captivity were therefore defined by recovery, of body, of morale, and of perspective. Meals became more than nourishment. They were symbols of a new reality in which the enemy's conduct could defy expectation, and survival no longer demanded the extreme sacrifice the soldiers had internalized as necessary. For many, this realization was the beginning of a long-term transformation, the first step in adjusting to a world that operated under a set of rules far different from the battlefield. As these immediate effects unfolded, the stage was set for longer-term consequences. The initial Shock and adaptation evolved into reflection, internalization, and post-war remembrance. Soldiers, who had experienced the care and regularity of American POW camps, carried these impressions forward, influencing not only their personal perceptions of honor and duty, but also broader narratives about the ethical treatment of prisoners in wartime. The long-term consequences of humane treatment in American POW camps extended far beyond immediate survival. Japanese soldiers who endured captivity began to reflect deeply on the contrast between battlefield hardship and the unexpected mercy they received. Post-war memoirs, letters, and interviews repeatedly highlight the lasting impression left by the simple provision of food, shelter, and care. Soldiers spoke of a paradox: the enemy who had been trained to kill them could also preserve their lives with dignity. This recognition challenged not only personal beliefs about honor, but also broader assumptions about warfare, humanity, and morality. Many former POWs carried these lessons home, influencing post-war narratives in subtle ways. Some openly recounted the experience of shock and gratitude, acknowledging that survival in American camps had been unexpectedly humane. Others internalized the memory, quietly reconciling the experience with their prior notions of duty and shame. Letters written after the war reveal recurring themes: astonishment at the quality and regularity of rations, respect for medical treatment, and a grudging admiration for the organizational skill and discipline of the American military. For soldiers steeped in the notion that surrender equaled dishonor, these reflections were transformative. The practical benefits of humane treatment were equally evident. Survival rates among Japanese POWs in American camps were significantly higher than among prisoners held elsewhere, particularly in territories where starvation, disease, and forced labor were common. By maintaining health and morale, the U.S. military ensured that prisoners remained manageable and compliant, reducing unrest and the potential for violent incidents. These outcomes reinforced the strategic wisdom of adherence to international conventions, demonstrating that ethics and operational efficiency could coexist. Cultural impact also emerged over time. Many Japanese soldiers recognized the profound dissonance between their expectations and the reality of American care. The shock of abundance and hygiene prompted introspection about values, human behavior, and leadership. Some reflected on the broader implications for society and governance, that discipline, order, and morality could be exercised even in extreme circumstances, and that survival did not necessitate cruelty. These lessons resonated beyond the camps themselves, influencing how returning soldiers viewed both war and humanity. Furthermore, the experience fostered a nuanced understanding of the enemy. For many, the perception of Americans shifted from an abstract, ruthless force to a disciplined, capable, and in certain respects, morally conscientious opponent. Prisoners observed that war did not inherently erase decency, and that structured systems of care could exist even amidst the chaos of global conflict. This realization left an enduring imprint on survivors, shaping personal philosophies and post-war dialogue about the ethics of warfare. By the end of the war, the combined effects of humane treatment, physical recovery, psychological adaptation, moral reflection, and cultural understanding had redefined the POW experience. Where once fear, hunger, and shame dominated, soldiers now carried memories of relief, surprise, and reluctant gratitude. The simple act of providing regular rations had triggered a cascade of consequences, illustrating the profound impact of compassion in a context dominated by destruction. As these long-term effects became evident, the stage was set for reflection. The story of Japanese soldiers' shock at American rations was not merely a tale of food, it was a meditation on culture, honor, human resilience, and the unexpected intersections of mercy and war. This reflection would close the narrative, highlighting what the experience ultimately revealed about humanity. In wartime, the story of Japanese soldiers shocked by American rations is more than a tale of food and Survival, it is a meditation on humanity amidst the machinery of war, in the midst of relentless battles, bloodshed, and deprivation. The simple act of providing nourishment became a profound statement that even in the darkest conflict, morality could coexist with military necessity. For the soldiers who entered the camps, each meal was a revelation. It challenged long-held beliefs about honor, suffering, and duty, to eat without fear, to receive care without humiliation, to rest in safety while the war raged beyond the barbed wire. It was a dissonance that transformed their understanding of what it meant to survive. The shock they felt was not merely physical but deeply cultural, forcing introspection on the nature of mercy, the ethics of leadership, and the meaning of resilience. The impact extended beyond the camps themselves. American adherence to humane treatment under the Geneva Convention demonstrated that discipline and compassion were not mutually exclusive. Soldiers' improved health, morale, and compliance underscored the practical benefits of ethical conduct. Equally important was the psychological legacy. Japanese prisoners returned home carrying memories of unexpected decency, reflecting on the enemy not simply as adversaries but as human beings capable of order, empathy, and moral responsibility. In the broader sweep of history, these moments reveal a quieter form of heroism, the courage to maintain humanity when destruction surrounds you, the wisdom to feed and heal even those sworn as foes. The POW camps, with their clean tables, steaming bowls of rice, and attentive care, stand as enduring symbols of the subtle power of mercy, a reminder that war need not obliterate ethics, and that small acts of compassion can ripple across lives and generations. Ultimately, the shock of those first rations became a lesson that outlasted the conflict itself. It illustrated how human dignity, cultural understanding, and moral courage can emerge even in a world defined by violence, leaving a legacy far greater than the sum of battles fought.